We're here from Personal Money Planning Central. Okay, we're both at home, but we are talking about our homes. Should you refinance your mortgage? Rates are really low. Does this make sense for you? Should you take advantage of these lower rates now? It might help or it might not. My name is Tina Hopla. I'm the marketing manager at Personal Money Planning, and Michelle Cooner is going to lead us through this. She is the president of Personal Money Planning, and she's a chartered financial consultant, a financial care planner, qualified professional. She's a chartered retirement planning counselor, etc., etc. So go ahead, Michelle, and go ahead and get us started with this.
Well, I know there's been a lot of headlines and news about our historically low interest rates and whether refinancing makes sense. And I can answer that very quickly for you. And the answer is definitely maybe. Looking up the rates yesterday, we saw that a 15-year fixed rate was going for about 1.88. A 30-year was at 2.38. And ironically, you would think that as you get shorter on the term of the loan, the rate goes down. And that's the trend we see right here, except for the 10-year. The 10-year was a little bit higher than the 15 at 2%. And I say that because we're going to look at that a touch later when we look at, being very myopic in your choices. And maybe it's a good idea to see the broader picture and look at all options available. So what we look at, kind of the rule of thumb, is that if there's about a 1% difference in the rate that you currently have versus what is available, if that makes sense. And again, that is a rule of thumb. It may make sense for other reasons. And we're going to cover some of those to see if any of these situations apply to you. One of the things to take into consideration is the closing cost. And these usually range anywhere from 3 to 5%. To give you a better idea of, kind of what that is, if you're looking at refinancing $100,000, that's $3,000. And that can, usually you pay those up front. There are some that let you roll it into the loan, but that is a pretty hefty amount that you're going to have to come up with. And according to the averages or actually according to Closing Corp, the averages in 2019 for closing costs, now this wasn't just refinance, these were, sales as well, ran about $5,750. So that kind of gives you a better idea. And that's oftentimes what kind of puts the kibosh on whether someone wants to go forward with the refinance is the closing cost. So oftentimes what happens is they'll get these deals where it says there's a no cost closing. And that's fine. Depending on your particular situation, that may make sense, but do realize that there's often a little bit of a difference than paying the upfront fees. You usually end up paying more as those closing costs are wrapped into a higher interest rate. So is it worth it? What do you think, Tina?
Well, looks like there's probably going to be some math involved.
Definitely some math involved. There are many mortgage calculators. So before we get into the math of things, a mortgage calculator works. I have an HP 10B2 financial calculator. You can also download it on the phone, but just type in mortgage calculator. I think we may even have one on our website when you look at the Money Guide Pro at the top, kind of towards the top middle left. That'll show you some mortgage calculators and some other references or resources as well. But before we get into the math, what we want to analyze what the primary goal you're trying to accomplish is. Are you wanting a lower monthly payment or a lower total interest? Now you may be thinking, I want both. I want my cake and I want to eat it too. And that may totally be possible. By reducing that interest rate, it may end up reducing the monthly payment and reducing the total interest. But if you had to pick one, what is your primary? And this tells us how we're going to calculate which makes sense to you. And it's also important to determine if you plan on staying in that house for any long period of time. We usually see the tipping point at around 3 years. Again, it depends on what your current rate is now, what the closing costs are, and what those savings are going to be, but usually around the 3-year point. So once we have that primary goal in place, we can run this break-even point. Now, if your primary goal is to want to reduce those monthly payments, then what we do is we take the monthly savings and we divide it into the closing cost. And don't write that down yet because I'm going to show you an example in a moment, so it'll be much easier. And if we're going to look at the total interest as being your goal, then we just run side by side amortizations of what the current loan terms are versus what the new loan terms would be, and then compare those. So let's take a look at that. Let's say the closing cost, and I'm just going to be really easy on this. Let's say closing cost, we're refinancing $100,000, 3%, $3,000 closing. And let's say your monthly savings is $85. We divide that 85 into the 3,000 and we see that it's going to take us 35 months to break even. Remember we said 3 years? We were pretty much right on target with that. Now, if the total interest is the way that you're looking at, that's your primary goal. Let's use this example as well, $100,000. We're going to use the 15-year term at that 1.88% that I mentioned earlier. And let's say that your existing loan is at 6%. And some may be saying, well, that's kind of high. That's not really realistic. It is not too high. It's not unrealistic because I have seen these and I've seen them fairly recent. I was looking at one just yesterday at 4.75. But oftentimes, like I mentioned, when to refinance, you're looking at those closing costs and do you want to extend the term of the loan? And so those may be hindrances when you're looking at this, but if you really break down the numbers, that's what it comes to. Let's look at the numbers. And so using that existing 100,000 15-year term at 6%, your total interest would be almost $52,000 over that 15-year term. By lowering the rate to 1.88, your new interest over that term is almost $15,000. That is a huge savings. Even if you had to pay that $3,000 in closing, you're still ahead by over $34,000. In addition, I mentioned, having the cake and eating it too. By having that lower interest rate and it being such a large amount, that would also reduce the payment by $205. Now, if your goal is to ultimately reduce the total interest, you've done that, but you can do more. If you're wanting to keep the payment the same, roll that 205 back into the principal, and you've now allowed yourself to save another $2,500. So this is what we talk about by running the numbers and not being so focused. And actually, this would end up reducing your payments from a 15-year to about a little over 11 years. So this is a really good example of what can be done, not making a dime more on a monthly payment. You're making the same monthly payment, but you're really raking in those total interest savings.
So just to clarify, one more time, when you roll that savings back into your principal, then that's what reduces it from a 15 to an 11-year loan, right?
Right, by paying extra on the principal. And I know there's kind of we say rules of thumbs all the time, and I don't know why we don't say fingers because there's just so many more fingers than there are thumbs. But usually they say if you make an extra 1 to 2 house payments per year, it'll knock off about 10 years. You just have, depending on the term and the interest and the payment, that's definitely possible. So what you're doing is you're making that extra payment that you've satisfied the interest, you've satisfied the escrow, and anything additional will go to that principal. And by lowering that principal faster, then you're lowering the interest more as well. Now you can't really lower and I should make a mention of this too. The way that your mortgage payment is broken up is what we call PITI, and that's principal, interest, tax, and insurance. Now, the tax and insurance, you don't really have a whole lot of say in that. That's what we consider escrow. And that may be wrapped in with your existing payment, or you may pay the escrow on your own. But regardless, you have that dollar amount. What we're looking at is paying extra on the principal to lower that interest down in the long run.
Great.
That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay. Some of the things that we need to look at though, even though you currently have a mortgage, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll requalify to refinance that mortgage. As we've seen this year alone, many jobs were lost, many were furloughed, many people changed jobs because, I mean, some just disappeared and they had to find a new job. And with something like that, some of the considerations and qualifications to obtain a mortgage loan, it also looks at your employment history. And if you, even though you've been at your prior job, maybe 20 years, you might have only been at this new one for 20 days. And so it really takes that into consideration and to see if you requalify for that. There's also an equity that needs to be met. Usually we say about 20% equity. If you have less than 20%, depending on the type of loan, usually this is a conventional loan we're talking about, there is mortgage insurance that has to be purchased on that to cover. It's also important that we calculate debt ratios. And I know, Tina, we discussed this during our debt management webinar about the different debt ratios that you have to look at. Now, with your non-mortgage debt, you're wanting to kind of guide that and not be more than, or really cap it at no more than 20% of your net income. And that's your net monthly income. Your mortgage should be no more than 28% of your gross, and your overall, which is the non-mortgage and the mortgage, should be no more than 36% of your gross. Now, here's where we have some issues. Let's say that you did or that you did purchase your home and you were under that 28% of the mortgage or the home debt. Well, what if your house appreciated and now your interest, or I'm sorry, your insurance and your taxes have gone up too, and that escrow portion has then raised your overall payment? You may be over that 28 percentile, and so that may be pulling your credit score down. So that may be a reason to refinance, to lower that monthly payment and then get your credit and credit debt ratios back in order. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Also, it's important to look at the credit scores. Now, I know we discussed this in our credit score webinar that discussed all the different types of credit scores. It's not just FICO. FICO actually has many different scores. There's a 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and now there's a 9. Some of those are industry specific, and one of those industries is mortgage. So usually the version of FICO that a mortgage company will use is either 2, 4, or 5. And that's based on whether they're using Equifax, Experian, or TransUnion. So, and I don't remember exactly which one goes with which, but you know, if you call that mortgage company or the lender and say, what version are you using? And they say 2, that would trigger you to know that that may be Experian. And so you want to go make sure that everything on that particular report looks good. It's also important to understand that there are the one credit reports or credit scores, should I say, that we see oftentimes are from the credit cards or your bank account. Those might not necessarily be a FICO score. That could be what we call a Vantage score. Those are the free ones. And those take into account some other things like utility payments, rent payments, things that aren't something that FICO tracks. And so that may be raising your score, whereas a FICO score, you may have a much lower score. So it's important to actually see what they're looking at and compare it to, and make sure what you're comparing it to is what, you know, is comparable.
Makes sense. Don't
Now,
want to compare, yeah.
Well, you want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples with that. And so you want to make sure that you're not going in saying, you know, I have this score, and even between the 3 credit bureaus, even if you're looking at, you know, the 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, whatever it is, even between those, you may have, say, an 800 on one, and it's a 798 on another, and an 805 on the third. So it's not, even if all of them are reporting the exact same thing, it's the weight that they give each particular area is their score. So it may be an 800 on one and it may not on another.
Okay. And for a refresher for that, you can find on our YouTube channel our credit score and our debt management recordings, I'm sure. As
Absolutely.
well. Refresher. Okay, back to the house.
So if we're looking at some of the reasons someone might refinance, if it's not necessarily just, the interest rate that they want to do, maybe their house has appreciated. And like I mentioned that, the TI of the PITI has gone up to increase that monthly payment. And I think most of us have experienced this a bit. I know I refinanced mine like 8 years ago or so, maybe a little over 8 years ago. And every year since then, it's gone up and creeped up a little bit. And I look back just doing this, I was doing some research to see how much mine actually had gone up. And it's been almost $200 over that 8 years. And so if you're on a fixed income, and let's say it's a pension that is not inflation adjusted, and your appreciation of your home is increasing, and so your taxes and your insurance have increased, increasing your monthly payment, but yet your pension hasn't, it stayed the same, you may be struggling to make that payment. So refinancing, even if it's not a full 1%, it could end up lowering that monthly payment and making it a little bit easier to manage. Also, I mentioned that mortgage insurance. If you don't have the 20% equity, they tack on this mortgage insurance, and depending on what the balance is and what you owe, it will depend on what the premium is on this. And it could be considerable. I mean, it could make a difference in making an extra $50 to $100 a month towards that mortgage payment. It might make a big difference. And so look at what the ability to remove that. You may not necessarily need to refinance. You may have an absolutely great rate. Say that you did it not too long ago and you've paid down, but you haven't reached whatever set number they put in place. Let's say that you did a mortgage for $100,000 and it's valued at 100,000. So you basically did 100%. And the trigger point to remove that PMI automatically would be $80,000. So once you reach that $80,000 mark, it'll drop off. Well, what if your house is appreciated and it's now worth 120 or 140,000? Well, you have that 20% equity, but is that trigger point reached? They may remove it, they may not until that is reached. If they do remove it, great, you've saved that money. If they refuse to remove it until you reach that particular dollar amount, refinancing just to be able to remove that may be an option as well. Also, if your credit score is increased, we notice that you get lower rates the higher your score is. And so if your score wasn't as high as maybe you would have liked it to have been when you first originated that loan, maybe now you might be able to get a better deal. And let's face it, currently with low rates, we're kind of at not just a supply and demand, but with really low rates. I know on TV you see this all the time with the car commercials and with credit cards that they're offering. It'll say those with excellent credit or highly qualified individuals. And that's kind of where we're at with these. I mean, they have a limited number of slots to fill, and they're going to be a little bit picky on this. So you may not qualify for one of the best rates. And so if your score has increased, shop around, see what's available. Whatever you do, make sure you can afford it by not over tightening those budget belts.
That looks
don't use a shorter, I'm sorry?
That looks painful.
It does look quite painful. Don't shorten the term just to lower the rate. As I mentioned earlier, if you're going in with the mindset of, I can do this at a 10-year term and pay it off on that time frame, look at some of the other options. Because even though you can afford it right now, as we saw earlier this year, it's not guaranteed that you're going to have that income necessarily. So you want to give some wiggle room. And what I mentioned earlier with the 10-year term being 2% and the 15-year being cheaper at 1.88%, it would make sense to refinance at the 15-year term. And then if you wanted to pay it off in 10 years, just make the extra payments on it. You're saving overall. And that way, if something does happen, if there's an emergency, if there's some situation where you need that extra few $100s a month, you would have access to it. It's also important to realize, just because of all of these things that we've experienced this year, I mean, who in the world would have thought that all of these domino things would have happened at the same time? I mean, it's just been ridiculous. And even as financial advisors, we play devil's advocate a lot. And we're like, well, but what if, but what if this happens? And what if it all happens at the same time? And I know when we run our Monte Carlo simulations, we run 1,000 different trials. And some of those are, what if there's a zombie apocalypse? And, so we look at all these different ridiculous things, and not even we could have predicted all of these were going to happen this year. But it is important in an emergency. Having a higher debt ratio on some of these things may disqualify you. So you may have racked up some credit card debt because you were off work for a while. These credit cards may, the balance to limit ratios may have you at a higher ratio on that will disqualify you or knock you over on your 36% or your 20%. And with the home appreciations, you may be over that 28% on the mortgage part. So make sure that those things are in order before doing any of this. Also, if you've used your credit cards, credit card companies, I know that they did a little tweaking of scores for the FICO score 9 earlier this year, and we saw some little, not giant moves, but some little moves within FICO scores. And so with something like that, if it knocked you into, let's say you were right at 800 and now you're below, even if it's 795, they may have lowered your credit limit, which then bumps you up even higher ratio. And so you have to look at those limits and debts and balances on all of them. So I think, just to summarize it, some of the important points here is to really first figure out what goal you're trying to accomplish. Then see what's available to you. And then also once you know what's available, you may not have anything that's available to you. So you don't need to go any further than that. But if you do find that there are some things that are available to you, then see if you qualify and see what stepping stones there are. Lowering monthly payments, or are you lowering the total interest? It's important to shop around for those rates and terms. Like I mentioned, the 10-year term sounds great, but the 15-year rate was much better. Verify the qualifications, call the lenders, see what FICO score they're using, see what you can determine what bureau they're using based off the FICO score. Just ask them, do you use Experian, TransUnion, or Equifax? And then make sure you can afford it. You don't want to be put into a situation where you're really gung-ho about paying off this mortgage as soon as possible, and then you end up messing up the rest of your finances. And
Right.
make sure that you're actually accomplishing the goals that you're wanting to accomplish. It's important to see if your goal is to lower the monthly payment, to give yourself some more wiggle room, then make sure you're doing that by not, tacking on a shorter term just to get that rate.
Right. And I think that the going back to your goal, it goes in place with your overall goals. So just like anything else that we talk about in these webinars, whatever your goal is for your house payment, does it go along with your other goals, your life goals, your education goals, whatever? It's just one part of your whole financial plan.
Absolutely. And we do go over a lot of these things in our financial coaching class. Really great segue. We look at the spending plan and help you create that to make sure all of these different areas of your financial life are met, including emergency savings, debt management strategies, couples and money. If you're not on board and only one of you are doing all of the work, it's not going to be a pleasant ride. We also talk about improving your credit scores and give you some strategies and ways to look at getting those numbers up so you do qualify for better rates on any types of loans that you're getting. We are talking about investing for retirement. Does a Roth account or an individual make sense? Can you hybrid a Roth to kind of maybe duplicate or maybe serve as your emergency savings as well? So you're hitting on retirement and emergency savings, and have that as kind of doing double duty for you. And we discuss estate planning issues because let's face it, you're doing all of this work, you kind of want to protect it. So you want to make sure that what you're wanting to happen actually happens. So for those wanting assistance in developing a plan and kind of doing a DIY, guided version, the financial coaching classes are wonderful. And we're going to start these out, starting from the basics of creating the plan and working all the way through to the end of plan, which would be end of life. And we're going to be starting those up probably January, I think, or the first part of the year, and then walking through each of these. We also offer one-on-one classes that give you a little bit more of a personalized feel to it, where we really look at what's going to work for you, not just a generalization, and we kind of monitor that with you and make any adjustments along the way that we see that are needed. So these are either with the financial coaching class or the one-on-one, these are some really solid foundations, and they touch on all different various important parts of your financial life. Next week, we're going to have Gary with us. He is going to take my place, I think, next week by discussing issues during a recession or market correction. And basically, are you ready to jump ship, or is there a way that we can throw you a lifesaver and keep you in the game? Our next ones, if we haven't marked your calendar yet, as I mentioned, next week or in 2 weeks, on 28th of October is going to be Gary. Then on the 11th of November, we're going to look at reviewing your property and casualty insurance policies. Not really recommending any changes, but just to see if you're overpaying. Maybe you're doubled up on something, or you're paying too much that you really don't need. Then we're going to discuss whether you should contribute to a Roth or a traditional IRA, and some end of year considerations, and what documents do you really need to keep and for how long. So save the date, write these down, and we'll be sending reminders out.
And as always, you can go to the events page on the Personal Money Planning website. Events are over to the right. And you can always contact us at the office if you ever have any questions.
All right. Well, thanks, Tina. We
Thanks,
enjoyed talking
Michelle.
about refinancing your mortgage.
All right. Have a good one.
Have a good day. Bye, y'all.